Good. Well, very sorry for the delay. So again, well, I guess I should just quickly introduce myself. I'm Peter Liddle. I'm a professor of psychiatry. I'm doing a joint presentation with Steve Coombes, and I will present a clinical background and a little bit of brain imaging background to the to set up a question that Steve will address with a mathematical model. So the nature of the problem that we're attacking, the clinical problem, is how to improve the outcome of schizophrenia. The problem is that despite fairly successful treatment of delusions and hallucinations, a lot of people who suffer schizophrenia have persisting disabilities. Now, schizophrenia is characterized by delusions and hallucinations. They're the sort of, if you like, well-known psychotic symptoms, but also by disorganized mental activity, and that affects thinking and also mood and affect, and also disorganized behavior. So we've got disorganization across the spectrum of mental activities. There are also negative symptoms, sort of decreased amount of speech or activity. And so the problem then is that, first of all, schizophrenia is a complex disorder with many clinical features. And despite fairly effective treatment of the delusion and hallucinations with antipsychotic medications that block dopamine receptors, nonetheless, many patients still have poor long-term outcome. So what's the mechanism of that? Now, we've got quite a lot of reasons for thinking that it's the disorganization features that are the strongest predictor. Certainly a number of good longitudinal studies have shown that disorganization early on predicts poor long-term outcomes. So what's the mechanism of disorganization? Well, there's two, if you like, hypotheses to the story I'm going to present today. The first thing is, of course, well, it's much broader than my own hypothesis. This is the predictive coding hypothesis. This was the hypothesis that was first proposed about 150 years ago, and a lot of work has been assembled to support it, although it's by no means, if you like, absolutely universally accepted. But essentially the core understanding is that internally generated predictions shape both our perceptions and our actions. So the brain generates internal models of the world, and these are successively updated in light of sensory information coming in. And once we've effectively succeeded this match between our prediction and the incoming information, then we get a fairly accurate representation of the world. And when it comes to motor actions, again, the proposal here is that we have a forward model of what the state of the brain and body are going to be as we carry out the action. And we continuously adjust the action as we're executing the action to produce a good match between the prediction and the sensory information. So that's, the predictive coding model of perception and action. And a lot of people would regard that it's very well established, although I think there are still people who would debate the details. Right. What we are proposing in relation to the mechanism of disorganization in schizophrenia is that there's imprecise predictive coding, and that's the core problem in disorganization. And I'm going in the next few minutes to show you just a little bit of evidence for why we think it's imprecise predictive coding, and to lead on to the notion that one of the manifestations of that is abnormality of beta oscillations in the EEG or the MEG. So beta oscillations and the confirmation of predictions. Well, first of all, there's a phenomenon called post-movement beta-rebound, and that is an increase in the power in beta oscillations. Now, beta oscillations are typically around 20 hertz, a range of from about 15 to 30 hertz in the EEG signal or the MEG signal. And if you make a movement, like, for example, a simple button press, then in the following couple of seconds, beginning maybe 500 or 600 milliseconds after the button press, you get an increase in the power of the beta oscillations. And I hope you can see my pointer. I'm pointing at this area of increased yellow color, denoting increased power within that box. Now, this is what you see in healthy people. This is what you see in patients with schizophrenia. And the feature I draw your attention to is that this is diminished here in schizophrenia compared to healthy controls. Now, there's a moderate amount of work that says the magnitude of this post-movement beta rebound reflects the confidence in the correctness of the executed action. So effectively, it's signaling the confirmation of the forward model of the action. And we're noting that it's significantly reduced in schizophrenia. So does that suggest a loss of confidence in the predictions guiding action? Furthermore, the actual degree of this reduction is correlated with severity of disorganization. So that sort of points us towards the idea there's something wrong with the confidence of the predictions. Now, another feature to note about the physiology, in fact, I showed you trial average data, the average across 20 or 30 button presses. But if you look at individual trials, then what you find is that there are very short bursts of beta activity lasting about 150 to 200 milliseconds. And that trial average data reflects the probability distribution of beta bursts. Now, for reasons that will become clear in a minute or so, I think it's more informative to actually analyze the brain activity associated with these beta bursts. So here, then, I'm illustrating a typical beta burst. You can see just simply an increase in the power of the beta signal. And if you look up here, you can actually see a line profile through at about this frequency, at about 16 hertz in this particular instance. You actually see this little fairly short-lived 3 or 4 oscillations at the beta frequency, and that is what's underlying this burst of beta activity. Now, if we look over here now, here I'm showing you that the bursts per second first of all, in healthy people, the dark black continuous line following a button press, and we see this rebound of beta. That was the blob I showed you in the preceding slide showing increase in beta in the post-movement period. And if we examine what's happening in schizophrenia cases, we see that it is greatly reduced. And here, this is a contrast of the beta rebounding controls versus patients, and that was a strongly significant difference. In fact, these, of course, are variants we have to do estimate of standard error to test significance. Now, what do these beta bursts indicate? Well, now there's a body of evidence that's reviewed well by Spitzer and Huygens. I've given the reference at the bottom of this slide here, that argues that these post-movement bursts are that they represent the activation of the latent content of working memory. And that's what I've stated here. So the bursts are associated with, I won't say they cause because that's not proven, are associated with the activation of the contents of working memory, which I think is quite closely related to the concept of the activation of the forward model. Okay, so we're interested in the brain activity associated with beta bursts. And we've carried out studies using concurrent EEG and fMRI. Now, that's a tricky technique because the EEG signal gets very distorted in a strong field of a magnet. So it's difficult work to do well, but I think we've done it in a way that we're satisfied with. And what I'm showing you here is the fMRI signal, the bold signal that you measure in fMRI, associated with the occurrence of beta bursts. And what we see is that we've got activation here. Now, the relevant contents of working memory here were actually the letters of the alphabet presented visually on the screen, and the person was required to not to articulate it. They had to prepare a response to the letter. So we would expect that what would be in their working memory would be the representation of the letter of the alphabet and the mechanism of articulating that. And this, broadly speaking, this is the superior temporal gyrus, which is where we expect the representation of the letters to be located. And this area up here is very much the articulatory area in the brain. So we would argue that this pattern of superior temporal gyrus and somewhere up here in the vocal area of the sensory motor cortex is representing the activation of the task relevant contents of working memory. Okay, that's broadly speaking, what we see in healthy subjects. Now, what I'm showing you here is the pattern in comparing schizophrenia with healthy people. Here, the orange is actually the overlap between schizophrenia and healthies, and the yellow is just the activation that was significant in patients, but not in healthies. The healthies didn't produce activation outside where the patients did. So bottom line is what we're seeing here is that patients produce a much more extensive activation. And what we would propose is that this indicates a rather imprecise neural representation of the task relevant contents of working memory. So that's the underlying the thing that generates this hypothesis that in disorganization, we've got this impairment of the post-movement beta rebound, and these beta bursts, which are the events underlying the beta rebound, are associated with more extensive brain activation in schizophrenia. We hypothesize that indicates imprecise coding, and imprecise coding would in fact lead to frequent errors and to mismatch between, prediction and what actually happens, and result in rather disorganized activity. So that leaves a number of questions. What is the neural mechanism underlying the post-movement beta signals? And Steve is going to address that with a mathematical model. There is an important question that I don't think Steve could touch on today. Do the beta bursts play an actual causal role, or is it just simply an associated process that's associated with the activation of content of working memory, and furthermore in the confirming of predictions, the predictions that guide our perception and action? And then the next question is, how is this disrupting schizophrenia? Now, Steve will actually address that, because he's going to present a model for this neural mechanism, and he's going to give a plausible way that adjustment of the excitatory inhibitory balance in the brain might lead to disruption. And then ultimately, of course, the reason I'm doing this, because I'm a clinical psychiatrist, is can we actually develop treatments? But let's understand it before we try to propose treatments. So that's the story. Sorry for the troubles at the beginning. I hope that came across clearly enough. And now I'll be handing over to Steve. So I'll stop sharing right now. Okay, so there we are. We've still got a delay on the line, or at least I'm experiencing delay, but there's Steve. Okay, good.
So, hi everyone. Sorry I can't be there in person. I've enjoyed listening to the talks this week, perhaps rather passively on the YouTube channel. So Peter has set the scene very nicely for me to talk about some of the modelling that his interests have inspired in our group. And I'm going to pick up, just to remind you, it was only a few minutes ago, but the story of, post-movement beta rebound. So what we've got in these pictures are spectrograms, frequencies as recorded in, large-scale neuroimaging studies from a point in the motor cortex, showing that, during a movement, there's some suppression of the beta, here indicated by this blue tone. And once the movement is terminated, power comes back in anger in the frequency band. So we think of these things as being related to underlying synchronization patterns of a neuronal population. So in the suppression of beta, we're thinking of event-related desynchronization, and of course, in the rebound, there's event-related synchronization, and somehow that rebound effect is reduced in the patients. So what I really want to talk about is the construction or the building of a parsimonious model. So the model has to have notions of synchrony in it, and the sort of, the first port of call for talking about synchrony and computational neuroscience is to think of simulations of large numbers of spiking neurons talking to each other. So that's where I'm going to start, okay, from a computational neuroscience perspective. And the hope is to get to something a bit more sort of reduced in the spirit of the mean field models that we've heard about throughout the week. So very, very simple idealized network, all-to-all coupling, describing a patch of, in this case, cortex. The neurons are spiking. And for reasons that will become clear, I'm going to choose a very simple, if you like, poor man's spiking model, the quadratic integrated fire model. So I will just run over the nodes in the network, and that's going to be capital N of them. So the quadratic nonlinearity that drives you up. If you blow up in finite time, you get reset. And I'm going to consider some sort of coupling between all the nodes, neurons, that represents a form of synaptic input or synaptic current. And that current is going to be generated by events. So TJM will be the nth time that neuron J fires. You just add up all these spikes and you drive, your favorite model of the synapse. And I'll come to my choice on the next slide. We'll allow some heterogeneity in the network. We'll have a set of, draw these drives from some distribution, which will be bell-shaped with a center, eta naught, and a spread gamma. And the model has all the right ingredients in the sense that if you run a simulation and do a raster plot of spike times, then you see you can get synchrony. And what we'd hope is that when we input a proxy for movement into this model, that this pattern of synchrony will be disrupted. And then when we terminate the movement, that the firing pattern will relax back to something like this, but it will, it'll over-synchronize on its return to base. It's very important, what I'm going to talk about in the development of these models, that we have a good model of the synapse. Okay, so this model here is good enough for me. It's the a very simple alpha function response, ubiquitous in computational neuroscience. A spike arrives, you measure postsynaptically, and it takes some time to get the maximal response, and it just drops away. So we're subsuming all the biology of the synapse in this filter. So it's your shape that goes like t to the minus t. 1 upon alpha will be time to peak. Those of you that know I'm from Nottingham, and I'm a big fan of George Green, you can think of a Green's function here that has this shape as its response. And also, many of you will know that the QF model is formally equivalent under a half-angle transform to the theta neuron model. So we can either think about the model in the voltage framework, the blue dot showing you when the spikes occur, or in the dynamics on the circle. Every time you whiz around the circle and the angle increases through pi, that's the same time as which a spike is generated. So a few years ago, the thermodynamic limit was considered by, in some sense, two camps. And both of these camps were able to use the continuity equation describing the distribution of states, either voltage or angle, to derive a reduced mean field description of this globally coupled spiking network with heterogeneous drives. So I'm going to talk about the more recent approach first, and that's due to Ernest Montbriot and colleagues. So they basically, both approaches make a guess for this distribution. If you find this distribution, you know as much as you want to about the network. So the distribution of voltages, they just guessed, basically has a Cauchy or Cauchy-Lorentz shape with a center y and a spread x. Okay, it's just a guess. So you argue self-consistently, you take this guess, plug it back into the continuity equation and see if it works. And it does. And moreover, you get a very nice physical interpretation of the center y and the spread x. If you average this spread x over the distribution of drives, the physical interpretation is basically that quantity is proportional to the population firing rate. And similarly, if you average this center variable over the distribution of drives, you get something which is proportional to the average voltage in the system, the mean membrane potential. A few years prior to that work, Henri and colleagues had basically asked the same question, but in the sort of the theta neuron framework. And they'd realized that they could use the recently developed Ott-Antonsen ansatz, which was applied, first of all, to the chromotor model to obtain this distribution also. So the basic idea is that here, this distribution, whatever it is got to be periodic in theta, because theta is wrapped around the circle. So you just guess a Fourier series for the distribution. Just gives you an infinite number of coefficients to find, a bit of a headache. But if you just pretend these coefficients are all powers of a single number A, then again, you can find a self-consistent evolution equation for A. And A also has a nice, very nice physical interpretation. Again, if you average over the distribution of drives, the A just basically is the Curie motor order parameter. And the Curie motor order parameter basically is just a very nice measure for synchrony in a network of oscillators. So I'm sure most of you have met it. And if you haven't, this gives the idea very quickly. You've got a bunch of phases telling you where the neurons are in their cycle. And if you sort of construct a center of mass object like this arrow here, that's the Curie motor order parameter. So if it's short length hangs around near the middle, there's not much synchrony. If it's long length out to the edge of the disk, lots of synchrony. Okay, so both approaches are basically saying for the QAF model or its equivalent theta neuron description, we can pretty much guess self-consistently the shape of the distribution, in this case for the angles. So if it's a flat, constant distribution, you're describing the asynchronous state with this order parameter goes to 0. Or if the distribution is delta Dirac peaked, it's the perfect synchrony, and there are shapes in between. But in both cases, you can derive these shapes, but they're parameterized by order parameters, and the order parameters have dynamics. So I'm not going to give you the derivation. I'm just going to show you the dynamics of these order parameters. Oh, look, an interesting aside, as there's a nice collection of mathematicians in the audience. So the first distribution, the voltage representation is Cauchy. If you introduce a complex parameter from the center and the spread, you get a nice formula for the Cauchy distribution here. If you actually do the sum in the Fourier series for the Anderson ansatz, you also get a Cauchy distribution, but not in theta, but in e to the I theta. But it's nice to make the observation that the half-angle transform is really, a Mobius transformation of e to the I theta. So there's a link between v and theta by a given Mobius transformation, and the link between this parameter here in the v representation and in the theta representation is exactly the same Mobius transformation. And that sort of observation underlies a conformal map you can build to bridge between the two descriptions. So if you like synchrony, because you do lots of studies of event-related synchrony and desynchrony with your MEG machine, you might like to just follow the Curie motor order parameter. But if you're somebody that likes to flood tissue with voltage-sensitive dyes, you might like to consider this new representation in terms of this complex number that uses rate and average voltage. And there's a nice conformal map between the two with the same signature of this that this Mobius transformation has. Okay, but let's just look at the dynamics. So rather than build lots of complicated networks, just have a blob. Everywhere in this blob, there's a quadratic integrating fire node, globally coupled, and I'm going to have an ortaps from the population to itself. Spikes travel along here, and in the rate framework, this mean field framework, these spikes get sort of averaged away into rates, and then the evolution of this conductance no longer feels a spike train; it feels a rate. But the rate is governed by this pair of equations. So the mean membrane voltage potential, unsurprisingly, has a quadratic shape, sort of inherited from the QAF model. It also now couples to the population rate, and it feels, the conductance, the input along this ortaps. And there's the quadratic equation for the rate. Okay, so if you like R's and V's, you would use these equations. But if you like Z's, Curie motor order parameters, then you would use these quadratic equations. Again, both systems feel the center of the distribution of drives and the spread. But I think the nice thing is a lot of us are brought up on neural mass models or Hopfield models of sigmoidal firing rates. In this first example of a derivation of a neural mass-like model, sigmoids don't pop out naturally. So I would say that somehow maybe there's the death of the sigmoid hinted at in this formalism, because the firing rate is a real valued function of the complex valued Curie motor order parameter, as indicated in this color plot across the unit disk. Okay, so does it work? Well, I'm going to resort to simulation. There's no proof, I'm afraid, but let's just look at the synthetic spectrogram on the right. So I'll set the model up, the mean field model, not the microscopic model, the mean field model, just a small number of ODEs to generate a beta. And then I put an input in, just a proxy for movement, which is some sort of square pulse, which ruins the power in this beta band. And then I release the system, I terminate the movement, and power comes back in anger, okay, which is consistent with the rebound phenomenon. And it's over a reasonably slow, long timescale. So here's the same perspective on that, but from a sort of time series perspective or phase plane perspective. So the blue circle is the original rhythm. It's disturbed, so you can go to a much higher frequency rhythm, but you certainly drop power in the original frequency. And then once the drive is released, you relax back to the original rhythm, but you go the long way around. You head back, but you hang around at the edge of the disc. And if you've got a good memory, if you're out at the edge of the disc, that's where the Curie motor order parameter is large. If the Curie motor order parameter is large, it's telling you you've got high degrees of synchrony. If you've got lots of synchrony, that's giving you a real boost to power, certainly, as generated by the currents in the synapses. Okay, so that's, if you like, the trial average story. Peter was very careful to say, this is trial average sort of challenge. And he also said, I may or may not be able to explain the reduction of the rebound in the patients. And there's many stories or mechanisms postulated for this reduction. I'm just going to say there's a simple one in this one population ORTAPS model. Literally, if you slow down the drive representing the movement. So I just take one of the excitatory synapses of the ORTAPS, of the drive to the population, and make it a bit slower. So this is sort of in the spirit of the NMDA receptor hyperfunction story. Then the synthetic model can show a reduction in the rebound. Maybe not illustrated so clearly in this diagram, unfortunately, but we can get a nice reduction. What I really wanted to move on to is the bursting story. So it seems much more challenging to develop a story of bursts, of beta bursts, these tens of milliseconds uplift in the beta band. So the top figure here is drawn from a paper generated by colleagues in the Sir Peter Mansfield Imaging Center, it's really the MEG group run by Matt Brooks. So again, a spectrogram. It's much more sort of structured, and you can see bursts, little patches of yellow, like the ones Peter showed. And they're what's a good model for beta bursts? Well, I don't know, but the naive one we had was, we sort of got the trial average. We got a candidate trial average beta rebound story going. It seems maybe if we have more time, we go back to basics, go back to scratch and start again with a completely stochastic model. But we didn't do that. We just said, well, why don't we take the model we've got, which can generate beta, and make it stochastic by adding in some noise somewhere, in our case, an Einstein-Uhlenbeck process, to the voltage dynamics. The bursts do look noisy. So this is, again, a synthetic spectrogram generated from this model poised near a Hopf bifurcation with a bit of stochasticity. Here's one of the synaptic currents. We're using a hidden Markov model to detect bursts. So we're not sort of doing it by eye or drawing thresholds. We're getting a machine to say when a burst occurs. And one of the challenges we thought we'd try and address is, well, mechanistically, is this good enough to fit data? And then we didn't look at the data that Peter showed. We looked at data from resting state. So here's some violin plots of things like the number of bursts, and Peter talked about the number of bursts per unit time. So real data, this violin plot, this sort of sideways perspective on a distribution, and with a bit of genetic algorithm optimization of the model, we could get a reasonable fit to real data. Certainly in the number, perhaps less so in some of the other statistics like duration of bursts and power. But you have to remember that at the moment it's a very simple single population sort of ORTAPS study. The more we layer this or build it up into networks, the more control we expect to get on the statistics that can fit real data. Okay, so it's really interesting to work with people like Peter, because they they give us interesting challenges, and some of those challenges we take in directions that they may not like as much as the one they pose. But the one that interested us was we had to develop a new neural mass model to have this phenomenon of beta-rebound. It's not obviously hardwired into our favorite models like Wilson-Cowan or Janssen-Ritt or Liddle, because they, in essence, don't ask questions about synchrony. The dynamics within population is completely washed out in those phenomenological models. But once we've got these sort of new models, we can keep going with sort of layering on other bits of biology that we think are important. So I just talked about simple input currents rather than conductance changes underlying synaptic currents. So we can add back reversal potentials and look at the role of shunting. It's very easy to include direct electrical connections between cells in this model, modeling connecting hemichannels for gap junctions. I didn't want to miss out on talking about neural fields, which has been really fun to hear the last couple of days. So you can stretch the models out in space, the line or the plane, and you can include things like axonal delays. So you can have a really fully featured new class of neural field models based on a reduction of a microscopic model, albeit a very, very special one, the QAF or theta neuron network. But you can represent, good models of synapses, gaps, axonal delays, connectivity, et cetera, And even when you start to just do, the sorts of things you might do in an applied mathematics department, simulate the model in the plane and track things like the Curie order parameter, you can get quite exotic behaviors of patterns that, it's not easy to see this in a standard sort of a Henri or Wilson-Cowan style neural field. Okay, lots of organizing centers, lots of spiral behavior, lots of interesting things going on. I'm not saying this is relevant to healthy behavior or computation. It's just an interesting pattern forming system in that doesn't need any input to generate rich structure. Of course, listening to the very nice talk of Daniele yesterday, I guess it poses the question: well, can you use those methods to evolve these models forward in time and on realistic architectures? And the answer is yes. And Daniele and I are very lucky to have a PhD student, Sami, who's taken some of these, the combination of the sort of methods Daniele's developed and this new class of neural field models and posed them on realistic folded structures to see the evolution of variables describing synaptic activity here, U, or the RV perspective, population firing rate and average membrane potential that are coupled together, or the evolution of the Curie order parameter or its magnitude that tells you about how synchronous a piece of tissue is. And of course, we can either simulate them in the RV framework or the Z framework, or go back and forth between them using this nice conformal map. So that really is just a bit of eye candy, and hopefully I've just introduced some of you who are very familiar with neural field models, a new type of neural field model that deserves, I think, some attention. For one thing, firing rate in this new class of neural field model is not a sigmoid. It doesn't have any parameters. You can't, steepen up your sigmoid or talk about the Heaviside limit. It seems very interesting to work with the F as obtained analytically. Moreover, the equations of motion aren't closed. So if G is your variable of interest, typically you look at a sigmoidal firing rate, again, of G, but the equations are closed in a different way. They're coupled to other variables representing either synchrony or rate and voltage. So as well as thanking Peter and Sami for the nice movies, Anya Byrne, who's at Dublin, and Matt Brooks, who's at Nottingham, I'd very much like to thank them, and also Daniele. And for those of you who are interested in, a relatively, terse, brief overview of these sorts of models, we just have a paper come out in Brain Topography, which summarizes a lot of the things we've done and gives pointers to the literature. So I will stop there.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Stefan. Questions? Yes.
Hi, thanks for the fantastic talk. So I have a question maybe more suited for Peter. When you showed these power spectral plots, it seemed like there was also strong power at lower frequencies. I guess you're focusing more on the beta band, but there seemed to be also, like, at least before the movements, there seemed to be strong power in lower frequencies that disappeared afterwards. Where is this coming from? If you consider this?
Right. Yes, we're intrigued by that, and we think that's very important. Now, first of all, we think that the timing at which the burst occurs is probably very important, and particularly if we think about this hypothesis that we're wanting to compare a predicted brain state with an observed brain state, then you've got to do your comparison at the right time. So in this notion that, the predictive coding account that I was advancing, we have to have a clock. And we thought that the low frequencies might, if you like, somehow represent the clock. And we examined the relationship between delta phase, the very low frequencies up to about 4 hertz, and the probability of currents of a beta burst. And we found an amazingly a clustered, basically there's a strong relationship. The beta bursts occur at a preferred phase of the low frequency fluctuation, in the measured EEG signal in our data. We're presuming that corresponds to membrane potential, but obviously there's a transformation from the neuron to what we measure on the scalp. So yes, those low frequency phenomena in the delta and theta are related to the occurrence of the beta bursts. We're proposing that this represents whatever the clock is that determines when the beta will occur. And the one other thing I'll say that may be related to this is that in a sort of an executive control task, not these very simple what you saw was, for example, we're doing, I think you could probably see I'm making simple finger abduction movements here, but we also do this sort of thing during more complex executive tasks. And what we find, first of all, when you make an error in, say, a go-no-go task where you're supposed to only go on a go stimulus, and if you go on a no-go stimulus, that's an error, then what you observe behaviorally, and this has been known for a long time, that you go slower on the next trial. So there's some sort of compensatory mechanism that is brought into action here. And what we have found in the EEG data of this is that the occurrence of the beta burst determines the degree of this post-error slowing. So now I'm not taking that directly back to delta, but what I'm suggesting is that somehow both the preceding low frequency stuff is related to when the beta occurs, and when the beta occurs, it generates a relatively slow compensatory process that persists, let's say, for 2 or 3 seconds. So undoubtedly, slow processes are crucial in fully understanding this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Other questions in the room? I will look at internet. Let me check. No more question. I had a small one. I was curious, maybe as a conclusion for this week about mathematics and neuroscience, what would be, how can I say? How would you speak, both of you, of your collaboration for a mathematician to work with a psychiatrist and vice versa? How do you like it, and what's this fun in this collaboration?
Well,
if you're happy, I'll start, Peter.
Yes, you start.
It's very easy to talk to Peter because he has a background in physics as well, and lots of experience in many branches of science. But I think I work in mathematical sciences, and as much I am very interested in the application of my work, but I'm not the person to pick the challenges or define the problems. And so I think many of us try and take on too much. We say, I'm going to, work on a problem in neuroscience, and don't talk to, people that have an interest in mental health, where the output of work could be beneficial. So I think it's very sensible to just listen, go and talk to your colleagues and find out what they're interested in, and then work out, a way to help. And in my case, I cross my fingers and hope that Peter doesn't want help with statistics. I hope that he wants help with
Yeah. Okay. If I can put in my contribution to that, to the collaboration. Now it probably helps that 50 years ago I did a degree in physics, but that's 50 years ago, and indeed my hair is much grayer now than it was then. So I've forgotten far more than I now know. Undoubtedly, the most important thing is it made me not afraid to talk to a physicist or a mathematician, and it made me prepared even to accept, if you like, that when I see equations don't worry me. I'm used to algebraic expressions, even if I don't understand what they mean. I sort of know that if I could spend maybe a week trying to work out what this equation means, I could make it work. So I'm not, if you like, frightened of the notion that it's a non-understandable language. Although I do have to admit, in the current state of my memory of all this maths and physics, then really I don't. I certainly don't fully understand. I couldn't attempt to replicate. If you asked me to deliver what Steve just gave in the past 25 minutes, I would sound very, very out of touch. So the main thing I'm saying here is that it's important to have. Well, first of all, I think we clinicians have lots of important problems. It's partly having the confidence that a mathematician can tell us something useful about our problems, and even to be able to get the gist of what they're saying. That's very important. Now, I'm not unique, but there are not that many of us who did a degree in physics 50 years ago, and indeed probably not many of the audience did a degree in physics 50 years ago. But anyway, the bottom line here is that there is a substantial body of, if you like, trust in mathematics in the mental health community. And so whereas a few years ago, there would have been very few psychiatrists who would be prepared to engage in the sort of collaboration that we've done. I don't think I'm unique in that regard, but definitely there is an issue of, from the psychiatrist's point of view, of being prepared to trust and to think that, these equations with the superscripts and subscripts and summation signs and integrals and whatever, that we sort of can get the gist of what they mean, and we'll trust that our mathematical colleague has actually checked the equations are correct. So I think it's a very fruitful sort of relationship. I think we are in an era when it's totally possible. For those of you who are coming at it from the mathematical side, don't think that psychiatrists or psychologists are not interested in trying to put their problems to you. But certainly you do have to establish, the psychiatrists need to be prepared to trust. You need to win their trust.
Okay, thank you so much for this nice conclusion about trust between mathematicians and psychologists and psychiatrists, etc., and neurophysiologists. Are you going to ask statistics to Stephen, or because he's very afraid of statistics, I think? No, it's just a joke. Don't worry.
Okay. No fear at all.
Okay, thank you so much to both of you, and thank you all for attending to the conference.